when David Walker stepped into his backyard on a freezing winter night. He never expected to find himself at the center of a terrifying mystery. At first, he thought it was just a tragic accident. A German shepherd, barely clinging to life, his frail body frozen solid in the snow. But as he carried the unconscious dog inside, wrapping it in blankets and whispering reassurances, an unsettling feeling crept into his mind. Something about this wasn't right. The scars beneath the dog's matted fur, the faint trace of a collar that had been forcibly removed, the way its microchip led to an address that didn't exist. This was no ordinary stray. And David's worst fears were confirmed when his window shattered in the middle of the night. A single note left behind: "Return what's ours, or suffer the consequences." That was when he realized someone wanted this dog back, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. Before David could even understand what he had stumbled into, the shadows outside his house began to move, dark figures watching him, waiting. His home was no longer safe, and neither was he. The deeper he dug for answers, the more terrifying the truth became. Ghost wasn't just a survivor, he was the key to something much bigger. But the real nightmare began when Ghost finally woke up, and David saw the look in his eyes, like something buried deep inside him had just remembered what he was trained to do. By the time David realized the answers, it was already too late. The hunt had begun. The cold bit through David Walker's coat as he knelt beside the motionless dog, his breath coming out in quick, visible puffs. His fingers trembled as he pressed them against the animal's ribs. Faint movement, a heartbeat. The German shepherd was still alive, but barely. "Hang in there, buddy," he murmured, shrugging off his thick jacket and wrapping it around the frozen body. As he lifted the dog into his arms, he could feel every bone beneath its fur, a stark reminder of how long it had suffered. The wind howled as David trudged back toward the house, his boots crunching through the thick snow. His thoughts raced. Who abandoned this dog? How long had it been out here? And why did it feel like someone had dumped it in his yard on purpose? Inside, the warmth of the crackling fireplace hit him instantly. He laid the dog on a thick blanket near the hearth and grabbed every towel he could find, gently rubbing its fur, trying to bring it back to life. The animal didn't move. His breathing was shallow, his body unnaturally still. David pulled out his phone and quickly dialed. Dr. Emma Brooks, the town's best veterinarian and an old friend. "Emma, I need your help," he said urgently. "I found a dog in my backyard. He's barely alive." Her voice was alert. "How bad?" "He's freezing, starving, and—" David hesitated, running his fingers through the dog's matted fur. That's when he felt it, a thin, raised scar running along the dog's side, just beneath its ribs. His gut twisted. That wasn't normal. "There's something off about him," he muttered. "Bring him in. Now," Emma ordered. David didn't waste another second. He wrapped the dog tightly in another blanket and carried him to his truck. The drive to Brooks Veterinary Clinic felt like an eternity, each bump in the road making David glance anxiously at the unconscious dog in the passenger seat. Something wasn't right about this, and deep down, he had a feeling he was about to find out why. The moment David rushed into the clinic, Emma was already waiting, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s. She had sharp, perceptive eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at the dog in his arms and motioned him into the treatment room. "Set him down here," she instructed, rolling over medical equipment. Two vet techs immediately moved to help, their faces tense. David watched as Emma worked, checking vitals, inserting and applying warming pads. Minutes stretched into eternity as she worked in silence. Finally, she looked up. "He's in bad shape, but he's a fighter," she exhaled, peeling off her gloves. "We need to get his body temperature up slowly, and he's malnourished. He hasn't eaten properly in weeks." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So, he's gonna make it?" Emma hesitated. That hesitation made his stomach drop. "I need to check something," she said. "I'm going to scan for a microchip." She grabbed the handheld scanner and ran it over the dog's neck. A beep. A number appeared on the screen. David expected relief. Instead, he saw Emma's brows furrow deeply. Her expression darkened. That's weird. David straightened. What is? Emma turned the screen toward him. This chip doesn't link to any pet database. It's registered to a private facility, one I've never seen before. David's skin prickled. What kind of facility? Emma tapped a few buttons on her tablet, searching through veterinary records. After a few moments, she froze. Oh my God, she whispered. David's pulse spiked. Emma, what? She looked up at him, her voice quiet but serious. David, this dog isn't just a stray. He's part of something much, much bigger. For the first time since finding the dog, David felt real fear creep up his spine. What the hell have I just brought into my house? David sat in his truck outside Brooks' veterinary clinic, gripping the steering wheel tightly as Emma's words replayed in his mind. This dog isn't just a stray. He's part of something much, much bigger. That wasn't the kind of statement you could just brush off. Ghost, because that's what David decided to call him, wasn't just abandoned. He was left here, in David's backyard, deliberately. But why? The thought haunted him as he drove home, the sky already turning a murky shade of blue as night approached. The air was thick with the kind of tension you couldn't quite explain, but could feel in your bones. He glanced at Ghost, still unconscious on the passenger seat. Wrapped in blankets, there was something about him, something that felt different. And not just because of what Emma had said. By the time they reached the house, the temperature had dropped even further. David carried Ghost inside and settled him near the fireplace again, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The dog was still weak, but at least now, he was safe, or so David thought. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the trees, or the nagging feeling in his gut that told him this wasn't over. Then, just past 3 a.m., he heard it, the sound of movement outside his house. David shot up, his pulse hammering. His first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray. But then came the distinct crunch of footsteps in the snow. Slow, purposeful. Someone was out there. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he moved toward the window, peeking through the curtains. The yard was covered in untouched snow, glistening under the pale moonlight. But near the edge of his property, right by the tree line, he saw it, a dark figure standing completely still, watching. A chill ran down his spine, and not from the cold. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen, ready to dial 911. But then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, turned and vanished into the woods. David stayed up for the rest of the night, every nerve in his body on edge. Someone had been there, and deep down, he knew it had something to do with Ghost. The next morning, he called Emma. Someone was outside my house last night, he said, skipping the pleasantries, just standing there, watching. There was silence on the other end before Emma finally spoke. David, I didn't want to say anything over the phone yesterday, but while you were driving home, I did some digging. That microchip? The registration traces back to a biotech facility that was shut down 6 months ago. The kind of place that doesn't just work with pets. They work with modifications. David frowned. Modifications? I don't know the details, but I know enough to be worried. If that dog came from there, someone is looking for him. And after what you told me about last night, I don't think they're going to stop. David exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He looked at Ghost, still resting near the fire, oblivious to the chaos unraveling around him. He wasn't just taking care of a rescue. He was protecting something dangerous. That afternoon, things got even stranger. It started with a knock at the clinic's front door. Emma had just finished checking on Ghost, making sure he was stable enough to stay with David, when one of her assistants hurried in. There's a man outside, she whispered. He's asking about a lost German shepherd. David and Emma exchanged a look. Describe him, Emma said. Mid-40s, tall, dressed in black. And the assistant hesitated, lowering her voice. Something about him feels off. David's jaw clenched. He didn't need to hear any more. Emma wiped her hands on her scrubs and headed for the door, keeping her expression neutral. Can I help you? She asked, stepping outside. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Cold, calculated. I'm looking for a dog, he said, his voice smooth, almost too polite. A German shepherd. He got loose a few nights ago. Very valuable. Have you seen one? Emma's heart pounded, but she kept her face unreadable. We get a lot of dogs here, she said casually. Any distinguishing features? The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. I believe he would have been brought in recently. Large, dark coat, a faint scar on his side. Emma forced herself to shake her head. Sorry, haven't seen him. For a second, he didn't react. Then, slowly, he smiled again, but this time, felt more like a warning than a pleasantry. Well, if you do. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small white card, pressing it into her hand. Call me. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the parking lot. Emma didn't move until he was gone. When she finally looked down at the card, her stomach twisted. There was no name, no business logo, just a phone number. She walked back inside and locked the door behind her. David exhaled sharply. They know. Emma nodded. And that means you're in danger. David looked at Ghost, still unconscious but breathing steadily. This wasn't just about helping a lost dog anymore. This was about survival. Before I continue this incredible story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever felt that special connection with an animal, hit that like button. Because as you'll soon see, this story proves just how far one man and one dog will go to protect each other. That night, as David drove home, he knew one thing for sure. Ghost wasn't just being hunted. He was being reclaimed. And the people searching for him wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But they had made one mistake. They had left Ghost with the wrong man. David wasn't going to give him up. Not without a fight. David barely slept that night. The weight of everything, the mysterious facility, the strange man at the clinic, the way Ghost had been dumped in his yard, pressed against his mind like a storm rolling in. Something told him this wasn't just about a lost dog. It was about something much bigger. By morning, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for answers. He was going to find them. The first person he called was Ethan Blake, a longtime friend and former federal investigator. They hadn't spoken much in the last few years. But if anyone knew how to dig into something this shady, it was Ethan. David. Ethan's voice was groggy, barely awake. Man, it's been a while. Yeah, I know. Listen, I need your help. Ethan yawned. This about that dog I saw on your Instagram? David hesitated. It's about where he came from. That got Ethan's attention. The sound of shifting fabric told David his friend was sitting up now. I'm listening. David laid it all out, the microchip leading to a facility that didn't officially exist. The strange man looking for Ghost. The eerie way it all felt like a cover-up. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. That's not normal, he finally said. If a dog has a registered chip, it should be in a national database, not linked to some private facility. You said this place shut down 6 months ago? That's what Emma found. Ethan sighed. Okay, I'll dig around, see what I can find. In the meantime, be careful. If someone came looking for that dog, they won't stop just because Emma sent them away. David already knew that. While waiting for Ethan's call, he spent the afternoon installing a new security camera above his back fence, the same spot where the footprints had disappeared into the woods. He had a feeling he'd need the footage sooner rather than later. Later that evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, his phone rang. David, I found something, Ethan said without preamble. That facility? It was called Blackridge Biotech. Officially, it was a research center for advanced veterinary medicine. But unofficially, well, let's just say they were involved in some classified projects. David's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of projects? Animal testing, genetic modification, behavioral conditioning, stuff that should have never been approved. There are whispers that they weren't just working with injured animals, they were experimenting on them. I don't know the full scope, but here's the kicker. When the lab was shut down, all records of their experiments were wiped. No one knows what happened to the test subjects. David's gaze flickered to Ghost, who was lying near the fire, still recovering but more alert than before. They were erased, he murmured. Exactly. Which means your dog. He shouldn't exist. David swallowed hard. Then why is someone so desperate to get him back? That's what we need to figure out, Ethan said. And I think I know where we should start. The lab might be shut down, but the building is still there. We need to get inside. The idea sent a chill through David's spine. Breaking into an abandoned facility wasn't exactly his style. But the truth was, he didn't have a choice. If he wanted to understand what Ghost had been through, and why people were willing to hunt him down, he needed to see it for himself. That night, he packed a flashlight, crowbar, and a camera. He had no idea what he was about to walk into. The drive to the old Blackridge biotech facility took just under an hour. The deeper he went into the outskirts of town, the less civilization surrounded him. Soon, the road turned to dirt, the trees growing thicker, swallowing the sky above him. When he finally reached his destination, a rusted chain-link fence loomed ahead, wrapped in faded "No trespassing" signs. David killed the engine and stepped out of the truck. Ethan was already waiting, leaning against his own car with his hands in his pockets. "You sure about this?" Ethan asked, eyeing the facility beyond the fence. "No," David admitted. "But I need to know." Ethan nodded. "Then let's get this over with." They slipped through a gap in the fence and made their way toward the building. It was a massive structure, cold and lifeless, its windows shattered, its walls stained with time. The front doors were locked, but Ethan found a side entrance that had been forced open, the door hanging slightly ajar. David hesitated before stepping inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something chemical. The faint hum of old generators buzzed through the silence, making the entire place feel strangely alive despite being abandoned. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Empty cages lined the walls, their metal bars rusted, their floors stained. Stacks of old files were scattered across the ground. Some burned, some shredded beyond recognition. But then they found the back room. David stopped cold the second he stepped inside. The walls were lined with medical equipment, most of it still intact. In the center of the room sat a long metal examination table, restraints still bolted to its sides, and on the desk nearby, a row of neatly labeled files. Ethan picked one up and flipped through it. His expression darkened. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. David leaned over to look. The file contained photos of a dog, Ghost. But it wasn't just a standard medical record. There were diagrams, test results, reports on behavioral responses, and then, at the bottom, a list of procedures. Subject: number 472, Ranger. Status: modified. Procedure: implantation of tracking device and behavioral conditioning protocols. Result: enhanced tracking ability, increased aggression. David's stomach turned. They were turning him into a weapon, Ethan muttered, training him to be something he never should have been. David clenched his fists. But he escaped. And that's why they want him back, Ethan said grimly. He's proof of what they did here. If the world finds out. Before he could finish, a noise echoed through the hallway. Footsteps. David and Ethan froze. Someone else was in the building. David turned off his flashlight. Heart pounding. The sound of boots against tile grew closer. Slow and deliberate. Ethan reached for his gun. his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, a voice rang out from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." David spun, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stood in the doorway, dressed in black, face hidden in the shadows. For a moment, no one moved. Then, in a voice as cold as the night outside, the stranger spoke again. "Hand over the dog, or you won't be leaving this place alive." Who was this man? How did they know David and Ethan were here? And just how far were these people willing to go to reclaim Ghost? The real nightmare was just beginning. David's pulse hammered in his ears as he locked eyes with the shadowed figure standing in the doorway. The man didn't move, his stance rigid, controlled, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Ethan's hand tensed over his gun, but the stranger lifted his own weapon before either of them could react. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged echoed through the abandoned lab. "You have something that belongs to us," the man said, his voice flat, emotionless. David clenched his fists. "He's not yours." The stranger took a slow step forward. "You don't understand what you've taken in, do you? That dog isn't a pet. He's an asset, and assets don't get to just disappear." David felt the weight of those words settle over him like a heavy fog. They didn't see Ghost as a living being. They saw him as property, something to be retrieved, controlled, owned. Ethan shifted slightly, angling himself between David and the man. "Funny thing about assets," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Sometimes they fight back." The second the words left his mouth, he moved. Everything happened at once. Ethan grabbed a rusted metal tray from the examination table and hurled it at the stranger's head. The man flinched, dodging, but it gave Ethan just enough time to yank David back and kick the door shut between them. "Move!" Ethan barked, shoving David toward the hallway. They ran. Boots pounded the floor behind them. Another gunshot exploded in the air, the bullet slamming into the wall just inches from David's shoulder. They reached the end of the hallway, bursting into what had once been a records room. Old file cabinets and overturned desks cluttered the space, giving them cover but also trapping them. "Window!" Ethan snapped, pointing to the far wall. David didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, using his elbow to smash the glass. Shards rained down as the freezing night air rushed in. The door behind them burst open. "Go! Go!" Ethan shouted, firing a shot over his shoulder to slow their pursuer. David hauled himself through the window, landing hard in the snow outside. Ethan followed, hitting the ground beside him just as another shot rang out, shattering what was left of the window frame. They scrambled to their feet, sprinting toward the treeline. The woods were dense, the branches clawing at their clothes as they ran. But neither of them slowed. They couldn't. Not when they were being hunted. David's mind raced. Who were these people? How many of them were there? And more importantly, how the hell had they known they were coming? It wasn't until they were halfway back to the truck that David realized something chilling. "They weren't here by accident," he gasped between breaths. "They were waiting for us." Ethan cursed under his breath. "Which means they knew we'd come." David's stomach turned. That meant only one thing. There was a leak. Someone had tipped them off. They reached the vehicles, panting. Ethan yanked open the door to his car, grabbing a second gun from the glove compartment and tossing it to David. "We need to move. Now." David didn't argue. They both jumped in, slamming the doors shut as headlights suddenly blazed to life behind them. Two black SUVs. No plates. David jammed the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life just as the SUVs peeled forward, tires spinning in the snow. The chase was on. David slammed his foot down on the gas, his truck fishtailing as he tore down the deserted road. The headlights behind them surged closer, gaining fast. "Faster!" Ethan barked. "I'm trying." Another shot rang out. The side mirror exploded, glass flying. Ethan twisted, returning fire out the passenger window. One of the SUVs swerved, but didn't slow. They're not just trying to scare us, Ethan muttered. They're trying to take us out. David gritted his teeth. Yeah, well, they'll have to do better than that. Up ahead, the road forked, one path leading back toward town, the other cutting deeper into the forest. David made a split-second decision. Instead of taking the paved road, he jerked the wheel and plunged into the trees. The truck jolted violently as it hit the uneven terrain, branches scraping against the windows. Behind them, the SUVs skidded, tires struggling for grip on the icy ground. Ethan glanced back. They're still coming. David tightened his grip on the wheel. Let's see how they handle off-road. The forest thickened around them, the path narrowing. The trees became obstacles, forcing them into a deadly game of cat and mouse. David maneuvered through the gaps with practiced precision. But the SUVs weren't far behind. Then, out of nowhere, a third vehicle appeared ahead. David's stomach dropped. They were being boxed in. Ethan saw it too. They've got us pinned. David scanned the area, searching for an escape. There, a small break in the trees, barely wide enough for the truck. He didn't think. He just turned. The truck lurched as it barreled through the gap, branches snapping like gunfire around them. The SUVs hesitated, the opening too tight for their bulkier frames. It gave David just enough time. He hit the gas, the truck bouncing violently over the uneven ground until, finally, they broke free, bursting onto the main road. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan exhaled sharply. That was way too close. David didn't respond. He was already thinking ahead. They couldn't go home. Not now. Not when they had just made themselves the #1 targets on these people's list. We need to disappear, he said finally. At least for a while. Ethan nodded. Agreed. David's hands tightened around the wheel. They weren't just dealing with some underground lab anymore. This was bigger, more organized, more dangerous. And whoever these people were, they weren't finished yet. David drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The truck rumbled through the darkness, its headlights slicing through the dense trees lining the abandoned road. Ethan sat beside him, eyes scanning the side mirrors, checking for pursuers. They had barely escaped the ambush at Blackridge Biotech. But they both knew one thing. This wasn't over. The men after them weren't ordinary thugs. They were trained, methodical, and well-funded. Ghost wasn't just a missing experiment. He was a liability. And David? He had just made himself part of the problem. Finally, after miles of driving, David pulled off onto an overgrown path leading to a secluded cabin deep in the woods. It was an old hunting lodge, long forgotten, but still sturdy, the perfect place to regroup and plan their next move. As he cut the engine, Ghost stirred in the back seat. The German shepherd let out a low growl, his ears twitching, as if sensing the tension in the air. David turned to Ethan. We can't keep running. Ethan nodded. No, we need to take the fight to them. David exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. We need to figure out who's behind this, who's giving the orders. We shut them down at the source. Ethan pulled out his phone. Already working on it. I dug into Blackridge Biotech's old files before we left the lab. There's a name that keeps coming up. Dr. Henry Calloway. He was the lead researcher on Ghost's program. David frowned. Is he still active? Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. That's the thing. Officially, he disappeared when the facility shut down. But I cross-referenced some data with government contracts and he held up his phone, showing a map. There's a private compound about 50 miles from here. High security. Off-grid. If I had to bet, I'd say Calloway never really shut down his work. He just moved it somewhere else. David clenched his jaw. Then that's where we go next. Ethan glanced at Ghost, who was now fully awake, watching them with sharp, intelligent eyes. You sure you want to bring him? David met Ghost's gaze. He thought about everything this dog had been through. Tortured, modified, hunted, and yet, through it all, Ghost had chosen to stay by his side. David nodded. Yeah, I'm sure. They spent the next few hours preparing weapons, gear, the strategy. The compound was heavily guarded. Storming in would be suicide. But Ethan had another idea. We don't have to break in, he said, a smirk creeping across his face. We make them come to us. David frowned. How? Ethan tapped his phone. A little misinformation. I just sent a message to one of Calloway's old contacts using an encrypted channel. Made it look like an insider is leaking intel about Ghost. If I'm right, they'll send a retrieval team to intercept whoever they think is spilling their secrets. David understood immediately. And when they come, we take them out, quietly. Then we use them to get inside. It was risky, dangerous, but it was their best shot. They set up at an abandoned truck stop along the highway, positioning themselves where they could see the approach. Ghost lay low beside David, completely still, his breathing steady. Then movement. 2 black SUVs rolled up to the meeting point, their engines humming softly in the night. 3 men stepped out, scanning the area, armed, tactical. David's pulse quickened. Ethan whispered, "Wait for it." The men moved forward cautiously, weapons at their sides. One of them pulled out a phone, dialing a number. Now, Ethan fired first, a single silenced shot taking down the man with the phone. David moved instantly, lunging from the shadows. Ghost followed, a blur of motion. The second man barely had time to react before Ghost hit him hard, teeth sinking into his arm, yanking him to the ground. The third man raised his rifle, but David was faster, slamming the butt of his own gun into his jaw, knocking him out cold. Silence fell. 3 men down, no gunfire to alert the others. Ethan crouched beside one of the unconscious men, already stripping him of his gear. Looks like we just found our way in, dressed in stolen uniforms. David and Ethan drove one of the SUVs toward the compound, with Ghost hidden under a tarp in the back. The gates loomed ahead, a massive steel barrier surrounded by armed guards. David's hands tightened around the wheel. You sure about this? Ethan adjusted his stolen ID badge. Relax. We look the part. The gate slid open. No questions. No alarms. They were in. The compound was a maze of concrete and steel, dimly lit by overhead lamps. Security was tight, but the disguises held. They moved through the facility, scanning every hallway, every door, searching for their target. Finally, they found it. A lab, active. Inside, computers flickered. Research notes covered the walls. And in the center of the room, a cage. David's blood ran cold. There were more. Not just Ghost. Other dogs. Other test subjects. And standing beside them, looking completely at ease, was Dr. Henry Calloway, a tall, lean man with sharp features and unsettlingly calm eyes. He barely looked up from his clipboard as they entered. I was wondering when you'd get here, he mused. David stiffened. He knew. Ethan pulled his gun. Hands where we can see them. Calloway smirked. You think you're the first to try this? You have no idea what you're up against. David's grip on his weapon tightened. Then why don't you explain it to us? Calloway set his clipboard down. Ghost, or should I say, Subject 472. David felt Ghost tense beside him. He's not yours, David snapped. Calloway tilted his head. Oh, but he is. We made him. He's the culmination of years of research, millions in funding. Do you really think he's just a dog? David's stomach twisted. He already knew Ghost wasn't ordinary. But hearing it like this, Calloway's voice softened. Tell me, David, has he started remembering yet? David's breath caught. The nightmares, the flashes of aggression, the way Ghost sometimes seemed to react to things he shouldn't understand. His programming is still in there. Calloway continued. Buried, yes, but waiting. It's only a matter of time before he reverts. Before he does what he was designed to do. David's hands curled into fists. You're lying. Calloway smiled. Am I? Then chaos. The alarm blared. Doors slammed shut. They had walked into a trap. David spun, just in time to see a team of guards rushing in. Weapons drawn. Ghost let out a low, guttural growl. Something in him shifted. His breathing changed. His body language tense, like a trigger had been pulled deep inside his mind. David's heart pounded. No, not now. Calloway took a step closer, lowering his voice. Let's see if he remembers what he was made for. Ghost's eyes darkened. His muscles coiled. And then he attacked. The world around David slowed as Ghost lunged forward, his body moving with terrifying precision. It wasn't just instinct, it was training, deeply embedded into his mind. The transformation was instant. The loyal companion David had come to know was gone, replaced by something more lethal, more controlled. The first guard barely had time to react before Ghost's powerful jaws clamped down on his arm. A strangled cry filled the air as the man crumpled to the ground. The second tried to aim his rifle, but Ghost was already there, his massive frame slamming into the man's chest, sending him crashing into a lab table. Instruments clattered to the floor, glass shattering on impact. David's heart pounded. He had seen Ghost fight before, had seen glimpses of this deadly precision. But this was something else, something mechanical, calculated. Calloway watched with a satisfied smirk. Beautiful, isn't it? He mused, stepping back into the shadows. It always amazed me how quickly they revert to their true purpose. David barely heard him. His focus was on Ghost, who was now stalking toward another guard, his growl low and menacing. Ghost! David shouted, stepping forward. That's enough. For a split second, the dog hesitated. His ears flicked back, as if struggling against an invisible command. Then the hesitation vanished. He launched at the next guard. David moved without thinking. He surged forward, reaching Ghost just as he sprang. His hands caught the dog midair, pulling him back. Hey! Hey! Look at me! David's voice was sharp, commanding. This isn't you. This isn't who you are. Ghost thrashed, snarling, his body tense with conflict. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pupils dilated. For a terrifying moment, David thought he had lost him. Then a flicker of recognition. Ghost's breathing hitched, his muscles quivered. David tightened his grip. Come back to me. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, the fight drained from Ghost's body. His ears flattened, his eyes searching David's face as if waking from a nightmare. Calloway's smirk faltered. Impossible, he muttered. David turned toward him, rage burning in his chest. You don't own him. You never did. Calloway exhaled sharply, then signaled to the remaining guards. Kill them both. Gunfire erupted. David dove behind a metal table, dragging Ghost with him. Ethan, already in cover, returned fire, dropping one of the guards instantly. We're outnumbered, Ethan shouted over the chaos. David's mind raced. The lab was a maze, but there had to be a way out. His eyes flicked to the overhead sprinkler system, pressurized gas suppression. Shoot the valve, he yelled. Ethan hesitated, then fired a single shot at the emergency system. A loud hiss filled the room as thick white gas flooded the space. Visibility dropped instantly. David grabbed Ghost's collar, pulling him toward the exit. Move! Through the swirling fog, figures coughed and stumbled. Footsteps pounded in different directions, confusion erupting like wildfire. They sprinted down the hall, adrenaline drowning out everything else. David's lungs burned, his heart hammering. Behind them, alarms blared, lights flashing red. The entire facility was going into lockdown. Then, a new sound, barking. David skidded to a stop. Through the glass windows lining the hall, he saw them, cages filled with other dogs. All of them experiments. Their eyes locked onto him, desperation and fear radiating through the cold steel bars. We can't leave them, David breathed. Ethan cursed. We don't have time. David knew that, But he also knew he wasn't leaving them behind. He spotted the control panel. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward it. His fingers flew over the buttons, scanning for an override. There. A loud clang echoed as the cage doors slid open. For a heartbeat, the dogs hesitated. Then, as if realizing they were free, they bolted. David barely had time to move before they surged past him, darting toward the nearest exit. Ghost lingered, watching them go. Then his amber eyes met David's. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He was with him. "Let's go," David said. They ran. Ahead, the emergency doors were already sealing. 10 seconds. Ethan was already through. David pushed himself harder, every muscle screaming. 5 seconds. Ghost leaped ahead, skidding through the gap just as David lunged forward. The doors slammed shut behind them. They were out. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, the cold air sharp against their skin. They were miles from civilization, but for the first time in days, David felt like he could breathe. Ethan sat against the truck, catching his breath. "That was insane," he muttered. David exhaled, looking down at Ghost. The German shepherd stood beside him, his fur still bristling, but his eyes, they were different now, clearer, free. A low rumble in the distance made David's stomach drop. They turned just in time to see a massive explosion rip through the compound. Flames shot into the sky, thick smoke curling upward like a monstrous shadow. Ethan frowned. "That wasn't us." David's jaw clenched. Calloway. He had destroyed the evidence. Everything, the research, the files, the proof of what they had done to Ghost and those other animals, gone. Ethan shook his head. "Son of a..." David cut him off. "It's not over." Because it wasn't. Calloway had slipped away. The people behind this, they were still out there. But as David looked at Ghost, really looked at him, he realized something. For the first time, the dog wasn't carrying the weight of his past. He wasn't just an experiment anymore. He was free. And no matter what came next, David would make damn sure he stayed that way. What a ride. From the moment David found Ghost in the snow to the explosive showdown at Blackridge Biotech. This story was packed with action, mystery, and a bond that defied all odds. But now, I want to hear from you, the incredible audience of Tapestry of World. If you were on the edge of your seat, if the story kept you hooked and wanting more, drop a 2 in the comments to let us know you loved it. But if you think we could have made it even better, comment 7, because your feedback helps us create even more unforgettable stories. And if you enjoy gripping, heart-pounding tales like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Tapestry of World community. There are even more thrilling, mind-blowing stories coming your way. You won't want to miss what happens next.